red light's on now. It is such a pleasure for my family and I to be here amongst you once again. And we have enjoyed thoroughly already the time that we spent together and look forward to the next couple of days and trying to put off leaving Loudon for as long as we can afterward. It is always a pleasure to be here. This will always be home to us, and we are so thankful that we have this time with you. This will be our third in our series of studies on the subject of eternity. As I stated from the beginning, these studies are presented with the assumption that the Bible is correct and is a reliable source of information on this subject, because after all, I don't know where else we would look if not to the Bible to determine the information that we have about eternity. We began on Wednesday by trying to get an idea of what eternity is. And again, though, I have to say that for me personally, in my present state of existence, it's a challenging term to wrap my mind around. But we noted that it is generally recognized to have reference to time without end, but also to what is referred to as an endless state of existence. Eternity, by definition, has no beginning, and more relevant to us, it has no end. So we talked about the first night what eternity is, and we took note of its reality and how the Scriptures present it to us as something that we all have in our future. And with the understanding that there is such a thing as eternity, last night we turned our attention to the fact that as spirit beings at our core who will live forever, each and every one of us, each and every person who has ever lived has a place or will have a place in eternity. We do not stay in the flesh forever. And even if we could, as we noted, we would have no place to live eventually, because this world that we dwell on in the flesh will one day be gone. Peter tells us in his final epistle that the material universe itself will be destroyed at the end. And so we took note last night of the fact that in eternity, there are two distinct final dwelling places or destinations for humanity. But we also noted that of these two possible destinations, only one was prepared actually with us in mind. Jesus himself spoke on more than one occasion of the fact that what has been prepared with man in mind is that eternal dwelling place with God in heaven. That's what God always had in mind for us. And so, we were created fit for heaven. We were created innocent. The Scriptures, however, teach us, and we're all aware, that we have all rendered ourselves as unfit for heaven, unfit for that place in eternity. All of us have sinned. And our sins separate us from our pure and holy God and prevent us from being able to approach him, because they defile us. They make us unclean. And we noted from John's words in Revelation chapter 21 that nothing that defiles is going to enter that place in eternity, the eternal dwelling place of God. And of course, that only leaves one other possible destination for those who have rendered themselves as unfit, for those who remain undefiled and therefore unable to enter into heaven. They are consigned to that place that was not prepared with them in mind. Again, remember, we referred to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 25, where he tells us that the hell, the lake of fire, was prepared for the devil and his angels. But as impure and uncleansed humans have no place in heaven, they too are consigned to this place in the end. And so these truths that we've talked about so far this week, these truths, the reality of eternity, and the fact that every person has a place somewhere in eternity, are key ideas and key thoughts behind this whole series. An acknowledgement of those truths should prompt more thought on the subject of eternity than I believe most of humanity actually gives to it. It's out there in front of us. Eternity is. And it may be closer to each of us than any of us realize, which we're going to talk about tomorrow morning. But be it tonight, I should say, be it tonight, be it tomorrow, or 30 years down the road, we're going to face eternity. And that's all of us. And we will face the prospect of eternity, time without end, in, as we put it last night, our place in eternity. Which, by the way, cannot be changed once we reach eternity. Our place in eternity, once we've gotten there, is set. And while eternity is certainly not the only reality out in front of most of us that merits our thought, it is absolutely the most important thing out there that we need to be thinking about. And thinking about this and thinking about just life in general, the thought occurs to me that most of us at some point in our lives come to the realization that the day will come in this life when we maybe won't be able to work anymore. Or at least for many won't want to work anymore. And so what do we do with that reality in mind? Well, we make preparations for that time. We make preparations for retirement. We know that a time in life like that is coming when we may not be able or willing to work. If we live long enough, I believe that's inevitable. And so we make preparations. I still remember a saying, I don't remember where I first heard it, but you've probably heard it as well, but it said, people don't plan to fail. They fail to plan. And I'm pretty sure that statement, when I heard it, was made in the context of someone trying to get people to plan for retirement in this life. But what do we do when we prepare for that new stage in life? Well, many of us will try to maybe set a little money aside from time to time and entrust it to a financial professional who will then invest it for us. The Google AI definition of the word invest is to allocate money, time, or resources into an asset, project, or endeavor with the expectation of generating a future return, profit, or long-term advantage. So we're committing effort in some form into this endeavor that's spoken of here. But key to understanding the mentality behind investing is the notion that we do this, we invest something with the expectation, really with the intent of gaining a long-term advantage or benefit. Hopefully the benefit we get, the payoff that we get, will exceed in value what we have put into the investment. This is the idea behind retirement investing in this life. We've got to be willing to make that effort, make some sacrifice in the here and now, with a view, however, to how it will all pay off for us in the future. And not only do we need to recognize that it's going to take some sacrifice that we have to be willing to make, careful consideration should also be given as to what it is that we're going to invest in. That's why we like to get professionals to do this for us, because they know what good investments are. But we want to be as sure as possible that what we are investing ourselves in is a wise investment. You know, there are some investments, as we all know, that turn out to be good investments that pay off well for their investor, and then there are some that in the long run don't do so well. I was trying to think of some examples along these lines. One thing I thought about, what about if 15, 20 years or so ago, you decided to invest in VHS rental stores? You know, they were a big thing at one time, weren't they? Blockbuster and all that. What if you'd sunk all your money into those? Where would you be right now? Also, I remember around the turn of the century, there were advertisements. I don't know, maybe you saw these or not, but this was before the smartphone explosion. But there were actually advertisements on TV that I would see sometimes offering people the chance to invest in the next big technological thing. And they were these kiosks that would be set up in airports and shopping malls and the like, where you could pay a small fee, insert some cash, maybe insert your credit card, and you would get 15 minutes of internet access there at the mall or at the airport or whatever. I actually saw one of these. Actually, we were traveling with a friend up in the Northeast back around 2001, and not having smartphones at the time, we had to use one of those to find a place to worship one night. But what if you'd invested in that a few years ago? What if you'd put all your money in that? On the other hand, what if you'd invested in something like a Bitcoin or gold? You know, we hear a lot about, or at least I do, I listen to the radio a lot and hear a lot of talk about the price of gold, how high it's gone. I believe it's going for somewhere around $4,000, $4,100 an ounce now. I can remember when I was in middle school and everybody was getting all excited because they thought gold might actually hit $500 an ounce. Now, if you'd sunk some money into that back then, you would have seen a pretty generous return on your investment there. We could think of other things. We could think of FedEx or Microsoft along these same lines. If you had the resources and been able to invest in those things around the time that they were starting up, well, you would be doing well right now. You would have a very good return on your investment, more than what you put into it actually. And you'd probably be living a pretty comfortable life from here on. But now, of course, I hope we recognize that money is not the only form that investment can take. There are other forms that investment, according to our definition, can take. It's not necessarily just financial. There are thousands of young men and women across this country right now, across the world, I suppose, that are going into massive debt so as to get a medical degree, become a physician. You know, I'll never experience anything like that, but I understand that most medical school graduates are carrying a lot of debt when they start out in the medical field. But they made an investment of money, to be sure, but more than that, they made a tremendous investment of time and effort because they're able to look ahead and see the payoff. They see a career that they will enjoy, hopefully. They see a career that will probably pay them well enough to pay off their debt and live pretty comfortably afterwards. You look ahead to that payoff. We might think of the sacrifices and the efforts that a world-class athlete makes to receive his or her payoff of maybe a championship or maybe a gold medal, and then after that some lucrative product endorsements. But in each of these cases, the person in question looks to the future. They see what they want that future to look like for them, and so then they make the efforts and the sacrifices in order to hopefully bring that future about and see that payoff eventually. You make these investments in the hope of that positive payoff later. And this is a notion and a concept that I believe is suitable to consider in the context of our considering eternity this week and how we approach eternity. Again, knowing that it's coming whether we're ready for it or not. Now, of course, the future can be an uncertain thing when it comes to investments. That's one of the more unnerving things about investing, particularly when it comes to financial things. Success oftentimes hinges on things that are unknown at the time we make the investment. It hinges on things that will happen between the time that you make the investment and the time that you hope to receive the payoff. You're hoping that all the right things happen, but you just don't know, do you? We don't know if all the things we expect and hope to happen will actually happen until they happen. Well, this notion is something that really should be encouraging to us when we think about the investment that we're talking about tonight. I said at the beginning of this series, and even again at the beginning of this lesson this night, that these studies are based on the premise that the Bible is correct about anything, but certainly on the subject of eternity. And the Bible, quite frankly, takes away many of the unknowns that might otherwise cause us to be willing to invest in things of this world or invest in things of eternity for that matter. Because we have the Bible, the future, the ultimate future is known to us. Now, we don't know all the specifics of what will take place every day between now and the end. I mean, I don't know how badly Alabama's going to beat Tennessee in October, but we don't know all the details like that. But where the payoff that we're looking to from a spiritual standpoint is concerned, the future is known. You can take it to the bank, as the saying goes. It is revealed to us in the pages of Scripture. We've talked about some such things already this week that we can know for a certainty. Again, we know we won't be here forever. Oh, we'll be, but we won't be here forever. Somewhere we will be living 4,000 years from now as men measure time. Remember, we mentioned some of those men that we read about in the Old Testament. Think about our father Abraham. Abraham lived here for 175 years. I told you about my father the other night. Dad's getting ready to turn 95. That's still a long way off from 175. 175 is a long time. Abraham lived on earth for 175 years. And he has now lived in eternity for somewhere around 4,000 years. And so if we were to ask Abraham, what makes more sense, Abraham? Invest ourselves fully in this life and in this world, or invest ourselves in the next life? What do you think Abraham would say to us? Because the fact of the matter is, again, as man measures time, we're going to be somewhere. And we're going to be aware of it 4,000 years from now. Now, we won't be here. We talked about that at length. We will have moved on to our next place, our place in eternity. But what is next for each of us after we leave here? Will it be better? Will it be worse? Will there be a positive return on our investment? Or will there be a negative return? Will there be a loss? Well, it just depends on what we invest in this context. And we recognize, all of us recognize, we've got to live this life. We're here. We need to live life. We need to meet our responsibilities of this life. And I'll even note that it's even okay to enjoy ourselves while we're here. I certainly do. I try to find joy and good things in this world, and there are some good things. But we need to make sure that we don't put all of our eggs in the basket of this world. We don't need to put most of our eggs in the basket of this world. Because again, this world is going to be gone one day. Like those internet kiosks that I was talking about a moment ago. So it makes a lot more sense to invest ourselves more heavily in something, well, that will be around as long as we are from that standpoint. In other words, it makes sense to invest more heavily in eternity. Remember how Jesus illustrated the futility of investing yourself completely in this life and in this world. And I'm thinking about the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12. And thinking about the parable of the rich fool and the setting in which that parable was related, it's interesting to me to take note of what prompted Jesus to speak this parable. There are times when you read about the parables that if you read a little bit above where the parable begins, you'll get some insight as to why Jesus decided to say this at this time. And it's kind of interesting. In Luke 12, Jesus has been teaching some important spiritual truths. He's been warning against being like the Pharisees. He's been warning people of the need to avoid hypocrisy. He's been talking about the need to fear God and the need to have faith in Him and be willing to acknowledge our faith in Him before men. So Jesus is talking about these great spiritual truths that we could say are related to investing in eternity. But He's dealing with these great spiritual truths, and in the midst of all this very spiritual teaching, a man cries out, asking Jesus to help him settle a financial dispute with his brother. And I can almost picture Jesus looking toward him and with an expression like, where did that come from? And He warns this man against the danger of getting too caught up in one's wealth and possessions. And then He relates this parable about a man whose lands yielded very well for him one year. He had a good year, as we would say. And the man then began to make plans. I'm going to tear down my barns, build bigger barns, and store up my goods, store up the earthly wealth that he's accumulated, and then he planned to live a good, comfortable life. And then he died. Or at least the Lord said he was going to die that night. And the way Jesus talks, he dies having spent his time only worrying about his earthly treasures. I mean, it's okay to store up for later on in life. Most of us do that. But Jesus speaks to this man really only worrying about his earthly treasures, and to use Jesus' words, not being rich toward God. And that's short-sighted. That's not wise investing. It's interesting to me that in this parable, in verse 20, Luke chapter 12 and verse 20, after God told the man that this night your soul would be required of you, after God had told the man, you're going to die tonight, do you remember God asked the man a question? Do you remember what the question was? This night your soul will be required of you, then whose will those things be which you have provided? All these goods that you've stored up in getting yourself ready to live a comfortable life in this world, whose will they be now that you're going to die? Well, you know what the answer to the question is? Someone else. That wealth will no longer be the possession of the man in question. It will no longer be of any benefit to him in eternity. He invested poorly. As beings who will live beyond the end of this world, we need to be able to see beyond the end of this world and the end of this life as we decide what we're going to do with the time we're given here. And the fact of the matter is, whether we are viewing our time here from that perspective, from that eternal perspective that we're trying to develop, whether or not we're looking at life that way, it can be seen. It can be detected and seen in what we do, what we're doing with our time here. What we do, what we do not do. Is our life all about the pursuit of fleshly and worldly thrills and experiences? Now, I mentioned a moment ago, I find much of this life to enjoy. I try to enjoy my time here and do things that bring me pleasure. In fact, I've talked to people before. I'm to a stage in life now where somebody asks, well, Jeff, what do you want for your birthday? What do you want for Christmas? I'm really not interested in stuff anymore. I've got all the stuff I need. I'm interested in experiences, learning new things, seeing new places. But, you know, and that's all good in and of itself. We have a young man down in Tallahassee where I preach now, a member of the church there. Hey, he actually lives with us. But a couple of weeks ago, he left on vacation. He went to Fall Creek Falls to camp for a week. And I remember telling him as he was getting ready to leave, oh, man, I wish I was going with you. Because I enjoy that. I love doing that kind of thing. I like to travel. I like going to ball games. But I certainly hope that I don't give the impression that that's all my life is about. That I'm living day to day just for those experiences. I hope no one gets the impression that that's even what's most important in my life. What is your most important pursuit in life? Think about it. If there are two things that you might be interested in taking part in, and maybe they're happening at the same time, and maybe one of them, well, you got two things that are happening at the same time, which one are you going to go to? The answer to that question tells you which one of those things is more important to you. Do spiritual pursuits win out over purely fleshly pursuits? What are you invested more heavily in from this standpoint? As I thought about this, I thought about the time that we're living right now. We're blessed to live where we do. I hope everyone realizes what a blessing it is to be in this country. And if you're not, well, I hope you get to visit another country sometime, because we certainly are blessed. It's been interesting to me to see all the people coming from all over the world and falling in love with life here, because we have it so good here. We just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the establishment of this nation. And it really is amazing when I think about it, and certainly when I've seen it through the eyes of people that are visiting here, the prosperity and the opportunities that we enjoy in this land. Boy, we need to be careful. I've thought in recent years, We've seen a lot of silliness in our culture, haven't we? That's the best thing I know to call a lot of what we see in the news nowadays, just pure, unadulterated silliness. And watching some of that silliness in recent years that goes on in our society, I have wondered if it's because we've been so successful. Would we be seeing all this silliness if the people of this nation were just trying to survive from day to day like people in many lands do? See, that success has brought about a lot of the silliness, is what I'm getting at. Our success has been a mixed blessing in this land. It has provided us, unfortunately, with so many distractions from the things that really need to take priority. What do the interests and activities that we pursue indicate about where we are most heavily invested? What is our attitude toward our possessions? That's another part of the success of this nation. You know, Jesus told that parable of the rich fool to remind that man that one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Just recently I came across an old article by Brother Connie Adams. The title of it was Being Possessed by Our Possessions. And so many people are. And so what does our attitude toward our stuff, material possessions, income, wealth, what does this indicate regarding which life we are more heavily investing in? Remember the account of Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler, the man we call the rich young ruler? In Matthew chapter 19, that's one of the places we can read about it. But we find that this man had lived a pretty good life. I mean, to see that initial interaction between him and Jesus, he has lived a pretty good life. But of course, Jesus is God. And so he is aware that there is one area of life in which he needed to adjust his attitude that was holding him back from fully giving himself over to God. And so he told the young man, in order to have eternal life, that man needed to sell all that he had, give the proceeds to the poor, and come, quoting Jesus here, come follow me. And if you're familiar with how that episode plays out, you know that the young man went away sorrowful, choosing not to follow Jesus. And the reason given that he chose not to follow Jesus is he had great possessions. In other words, he was unwilling to part with them in order to follow Jesus. That's short-sighted. That's bad investing. Now, of course, it is at this time also that Jesus famously said that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you tonight, everyone in this room is rich. Now, we don't think of ourselves that way, do we? We think of Bill Gates or some celebrity. Again, look around, look at the world around us. Everyone in this room is rich. And so we need to be careful, lest we let our lives demonstrate that we value our possessions and our wealth over anything else, that is what we are most heavily invested in. It is so easy to get caught up in this if we're not careful, particularly living where we do. We need to give attention to our attitude toward our stuff. And we need to give attention to what's on our mind, what we think about, what we talk about. I like to talk about sports. I like to talk about music. I even like to talk about politics. You know, they always say you should never discuss religion and politics. Those are my two favorite things to discuss. But anyway, I like to talk about a lot of different things. But are such things as sports, politics, or music, things like that, is that all we ever talk about? Is that all we ever think about? I tell you what, over the past couple of years, once again, I've become aware that this is the case with many in our culture. That on one or more of these subjects, people are obsessed, and that's all they ever talk about. It's their religion, basically. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, Paul writes, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." A person who is heavily invested in eternity will do this and will spend time meditating and thinking and talking about what really is the most important thing. Early on in our marriage, before we ever had any kids, Tanya and I lived down in the southern part of the state, down on the Alabama line. And we worshiped with a fella there in Fayetteville. And this fella, I remember more than once, we might be at a get-together, or we might just be sitting on one another's front porch. But every so often, he'd just look at me and say, Jeff, let's talk about something spiritual. He wanted to make sure that he was as invested in eternity as he needed to be. And so he saw the need to spend time talking and thinking about such things. Again, I enjoy talking about these other things as well. But I should also enjoy and really be inclined toward talking about spiritual things as well. I do believe that this also is an indicator to us and to those who know us of what we are more heavily invested in, this world or the next. And this is one of those areas, and there are a lot of areas like this when it comes to Christianity. It's one of those areas where ultimately we just need to be honest with ourselves. You know, privately, I believe every person in this room knows privately if he or she is more heavily invested in this life or the next. Now, considering why this assembly is being held tonight, I like to think that most of us are investing ourselves in eternity. But you know, in a crowd this size, it's almost inevitable that there's someone here who needs to give more thought to this, perhaps, than they have up until now. How much time are you devoting to your spiritual investment? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I mentioned the episode of the rich young ruler from Matthew 19. You know, after that young man walked away disappointed, and by the way, I don't think he was the only one disappointed that day. Don't you imagine Jesus was kind of disappointed too? But anyway, after that young man had left, Peter pointed out to Jesus that he and the others had left all to follow him. They were heavily invested. And Peter was interested in the return on his investment, because he asked Jesus in verse 27, Matthew 19 and 27, what shall we have? And then, beginning in verse 28, we have the answer that Jesus gives to Peter. Assuredly, I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. In other words, Peter, you're making a good investment. And down to the present day, it remains true that investing in eternity by following Jesus is the best investment any of us will ever make. There will be challenges to our faith. There will be downtimes. You know, even in the financial world, we recognize that the market goes ups and downs, and the balance of our accounts will go up and down with the market. But you don't bail out just because of a temporary downturn. You ride that time out, you stick with that investment, and you almost always, as a result, see the investment rise again and pay off like you want it to. What Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16 is, therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Remember, you're going to live forever somewhere. So your best bet for happiness throughout your existence is to invest in those unseen things that Paul talks about, the eternal things. Invest yourself in the eternity that is to come. Thank you for your attention this evening. Go ahead and get ready to sing the song that Aaron has selected for us. The first step in being properly invested in this regard is to render obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ. You don't get the payoff without the investment. And if there's anyone here tonight that needs to make that initial investment, we stand ready to assist you. We can accommodate your desire to be baptized, to be immersed in water based on your faith in Jesus as the Son of God. You do that, your sins will be cleansed. You will be added to the Lord's church, that body of saved believers bound for heaven. If you're a child of God and you realize that you have not been investing in yourself like you should, and if there's something currently between you and God, if you can take care of that between you and God, then I urge you to do so. But again, so oftentimes we need the help of our brethren. So oftentimes we need to acknowledge sin before our brethren. And if that is your need tonight, we stand ready to assist you as well. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Don't let this investment opportunity pass by if you need to make it tonight. Please come as we stand and sing together.